last few people join, but let me start by saying welcome and so glad to have all of you here today. I'm Celia Klin. I'm the interim dean of Harper College, and I'm also a professor in the Department of Psychology. And we're really thrilled that so many people can join us today. I can see the numbers rising. We're at about 83 now and still going up. I know we've got lots of Binghamton and Harper alumni, and it's great to have you here, current faculty, staff, and students, and also members of the community. You are in for such a treat today, and we're really excited and so grateful that Professor David Schultz has agreed to spend some time with us today. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who made this event possible, both those who helped to organize the event and those who are co-sponsoring the event. So first, a thank you to our sponsors, the College of Community and Public Affairs, the Institute for Justice and Wellbeing, the Harper Edge, and Harper College of Arts and Sciences. I wanted to say a special thank you to Aaron Cody in Harper Edge, Debbie Collette O'Brien in CCPA, Jim Scott in the Center for Learning and Teaching, and Leah Joggers in the Harper College Dean's Office. I am extremely pleased to be able to welcome Harper College alumnus, Professor David Schultz today. He comes to us as an attorney, a professor, a scholar, and a teacher. David Schultz is currently a professor at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. He teaches courses in American politics and public policy. He is also a professor at the University of Minnesota School of Law, where he contributes courses based on his expertise in election law, professional ethics, state constitutional law, and eminent domain and land use law. David Schultz has many, many degrees, including a bachelor's, BA in political science and in philosophy from Harper College, and thus we get to claim him as one of our own. He also has a master's degree from Binghamton in philosophy, and then the list goes on. He has a master's in political science from Rutgers, a master's in astronomy from James Cook University. He's earned a PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota, a JD from the University of Minnesota Law School, and finally an LLM from the University of London. David Schultz is both an impressive scholar and a dedicated teacher. He is a 3-time Fulbright Senior Specialist, having taught in Armenia, Hungary, and Lithuania. He's also traveled extensively, teaching and speaking around the world. Other evidence of his dedication to excellence in teaching include being the winner of the Leslie A. Whittington National Award for Excellence in Public Affairs Teaching. And for many years, he was named a super professor by the United States by Faculty Row. David Schultz has published more books and articles than one can count. In addition to his publications, you may have seen his name or heard his name in prestigious places such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Economist, National Public Radio, and the list goes on and on. His most recent books include Money in American Politics, an encyclopedia, and Presidential Swing States. We are so lucky to have him speaking to us today, less than a week before Election Day for this incredibly important election. And here is David Schultz. Please welcome him, join me in welcome him for his talk today, The Electoral College in American Politics. Is this any way to pick a president? So welcome, David. We're so glad to have you here today.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. And what I want to do today is to talk about a topic that during a presidential election year, I probably get more questions about than anything else. And that question is, what is the Electoral College? How does it operate? Should we keep it? Should we get rid of it? A whole range of questions that deal with that institution. So what I want to do today is to provide kind of a historical context, talk a little bit about why we have it, how it was created, about how it's evolved over history. But for those of you who are, let's say, debaters, you might really appreciate why I want to set this up. I almost want to set this up in terms of posing a question. Posing the question like for a debate format, resolve, the Electoral College should be replaced with the direct popular vote. In some ways, what I'm going to try to do is give you evidence on both sides, arguments on both sides there, and hope that we can have maybe a lively discussion. And if not a lively discussion simply today, a bunch of information that you can take with you beyond today to think about the Electoral College. So this is going to be our goal. Explain it, talk about how it operates, how it's evolved over time, and then set us up, hopefully, so that we can have this conversation about it. Now, To understand the Electoral College, we need to take us back in time. Obviously, needs to take us back in time to 1788. And think about where we were. Actually, I might even take us back a little bit further than 1788. I might take us back to 1776, because to understand the creation of the Electoral College, we need to understand something very important. And it's a concept or a term that Richard Hofstadter, a famous American historian, talked about. And he said that, guess what? That American politics was born out of fear. And fear is the buzzword that we're going to try to develop and explain here. And let's explain what was going on. Okay. Think back to 1776. All of us at some point have read the Declaration of Independence. Many of us have had sort of impressed into our brains the language of the Declaration of Independence. You know, the opening first paragraph lines: when in the course of human events becomes necessary for one nation to absolve or dissolve its political bonds. We all know the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, presumably we hope women, are created equal also. But we forget about the second half of the Declaration of Independence. It's a bill of particulars, an indictment, almost like a criminal indictment against the King of England for all the abuses of power that he's inflicted upon the colonies. Pretty much us claiming that he was not treating us properly as British citizens, and therefore, because of those reasons, we should be independent. The reason why I mention this is that coming out of the Declaration of Independence, there was this fear of strong central power, the idea that we shouldn't create too powerful of a government. We then create, in our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, a relatively weak government. A relatively weak government in the sense that the national government does not have a lot of authority. There's no Supreme Court. There's a weak one House of Congress, and the presidency that it existed became a rotating presidency that didn't last very long among individuals who served in it. And so we had this pretty weak institution as a president. Get us to 1788, and in 1787, I should say, fear kicks in a different way. It is a fear at this point of too weak of a government, unable to keep order, unable to address the important problems of the day. And so the way Richard Hofstadter describes it on one level, there is this fear on the one hand of having too powerful of a national government, too powerful of an executive, for fear it would turn into a king. On the other end, there is this fear that if we didn't have strong enough of a government, it would be what? It would be a situation where the republic wouldn't hold together. So on one level, this is one of the fears: how to balance too much power in a national government versus too much or too little power in a national government. I don't want to quite call this, and I tell my students never to use this term in a paper. I don't want to call it a Goldilocks moment, but there's a little bit of a Goldilocks moment here. Remember the story of Goldilocks and the three bears? The bed that's too big, the bed that's too small, the bed is just right, the porridge too hot, too cold, that's just right. Same idea here: how to balance these competing fears. And in doing that, one of the discussions turned quickly to who's going to head this new national government. And the talk turned to the idea of creating a president. Now, we're all enamored by Alexander Hamilton these days. We've all seen the play. We've read Cherno's book about Alexander Hamilton. He seems to be the framer du jour, or at least for the last few years. At the Constitutional Convention, 1787, Alexander Hamilton shows up, gives this very bizarre speech about saying that, well, the new president should be somebody selected for life. Gives a speech, runs off, never comes back again. Nobody goes along with that. But it does raise an interesting question, that the framers did want to create a presidency, did want to create a stronger office than we had before. But now we're confronted with the question of what? How do we select or pick this person? Keep in mind another part of the context of American politics. In 1787, if we were to do a survey of the governments around the world, they were all what? Monarchies or principalities, or maybe some type of military governments, but mostly some type of monarchies or something like that. There wasn't this experience of the idea of saying we have of something approaching popular government or representative government, or today's language of a democracy. So they're searching for ideas for what to do. And so at the Constitutional Convention, not only is there a discussion regarding what powers this new president should have, how powerful should he be, but also over the selection of the president of the United States. And although early on in the Constitutional Convention, there were a few people who suggested, well, perhaps maybe this president could be chosen directly by the people. That was pretty much rejected by the framers. Some of it was also again about fear of that perhaps the average person would not make good choices, fear perhaps of the rabble, but who knows? So that was kind of rejected, and the discussion of the actual selection of the president was kind of pushed a little bit further into later in the convention. But it's also important to remember a few other things about this Constitutional Convention, because again, Richard Hofstadter's phrase is still good, that fear is what defined the convention. So we had not only this fear of too weak of a government or too powerful of a government, of too weak of a president, too powerful, but there were other fears too. And this was the fear of what? The big states versus the small states in terms of population, the free states versus the slave states. It was about what? North versus South. Each one of these factions, each one of these groups was fearful that a new constitution would shift power away from them. So the small states, of course, were fearful that representation, if turned in a different way, would make them irrelevant, or big states fearful that small states would have too much power. And of course, free and slave states were fearful that what? Depending on how the Constitution was set up, we would either become a republic all free or all slave. So these were issues that were dominating the convention. And one of the things I want to point out is how, and this is probably not a pretty part of American history, how clearly this fear, but more importantly, how the issue of race dominated our constitutional convention and eventually influenced the creation of the Electoral College. And it starts with the debates first between the small states, that is, small populous states, and the more populous states. Some of you who might remember your history, it starts off with what? The New Jersey Plan, where the New Jersey Plan is the idea of saying that the new national government should have representation in Congress based upon equality of all states. Virginia says no, the plan should be that states are represented on the basis of what? On population. That doesn't fly. Eventually, the Connecticut Compromise plan is the idea of saying that what? We'll have two houses in Congress, one based on population, one based upon equality. That's one compromise. But now the question became about representation. If we are going to have some representation in Congress based upon population, who gets to count? The southern states want to count the slaves as part of their population because that would add 1/3 in terms of their population and give them far more weight. The North doesn't agree with that. And what happens is also the northern states and the southern states are disagreeing over taxes and how we're going to assess taxes based upon population. And unfortunately, what emerges is the compromise. The compromise, some of you might remember, is called the 3/5 compromise. And that what the free and slave states agreed on was the idea of saying that slaves, although that term is never used in the Constitution, would be counted for the purposes of representation and taxes as 3/5 of persons. And so slavery ensconced defined the representation issue as well as the structure of Congress. But now we were turning to the selection of the presidency. How should we pick the president? Again, as I mentioned to you, no one was going to go along with the Alexander Hamilton, pick somebody for life. There was almost no support for the idea of direct popular vote. Instead, the idea was fashioned on, well, maybe what we should do is have the states pick the president of the United States. And originally, one of the ideas was that states directly through their state legislatures would pick the president of the United States. That was that was eventually rejected. And again, closer to the end of the Constitutional Convention, the idea that was proposed was what? It would be that the state legislatures would then pick special individuals who we call electors. Those electors would then pick the president of the United States. And even after we have changed, and I talked to you, or changed the way the presidential elections have operated over time through amendment and through practice, the basic system remains in place today, that at the end of the day, how the president of the United States is picked is by the states. That at present, and I'll come back to this again in a few minutes here, it's essentially a 50 state plus District of Columbia selection of the president, where state legislatures designate electors who then pick the president of the United States. That's the basic model. Now, I'm going to develop this more in a minute here. I want to mention a couple of other things also for setting the context here. In terms of also understanding 1787, one of the other debates that was influenced, unfortunately, by the slavery issue was voting rights. That if we pick up the text of the Constitution, nowhere explicitly in the text of the Constitution does it indicate that there is a right to vote. In fact, the framers disagreed over voting rights, and largely what they decided to do was punt and leave that up to the states to make their own decisions. And of course, back in 1787, states had relatively restrictive laws regarding voting. As I like to tell my students today, the model of who could vote: white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who owned land and who were at least age 21. This excluded women, people of color, people in servitude, Native Americans. It was hardly the we the people to think about. But I mention this because the issue about voting is excluded from the Constitution, again, devolves to states. And the other thing, one of the things that the framers were very fearful of were political parties. That in 1787, when they drafted the Constitution, they were hoping that political parties wouldn't emerge, viewing them as factions, as dangers that would perhaps threaten the republic and tear us apart by party, as opposed to people coming together for the good of the nation. So keeping all that in mind, that the original Constitution didn't address voting, didn't have a clause or presuppose that parties weren't going to exist, had all these fears that I talked about. It settles on states, state legislatures being given the authority to pick the president of the United States. So let me explain, and I have to walk this through here. And by the way, I have a really nifty handout on this, and I can make this available through Aaron or whoever it is, and they can make that handout available to you, kind of like my 4-page cheat sheet on the Electoral College. But let's outline this here. Okay, so Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution outlines the original schema for how the Electoral College was going to operate. Okay, and here's what it says. Again, it says that the states pick the president of the United States. There would be no individual constitutional right to vote for president of the United States. That has never changed. Okay, so states still pick the president of the United States. And under the original Constitution, how it was set up is that the states would do this by having the state legislatures select electors who would then eventually pick the president of the United States. Now, how are these electors determined, or who were they? Well, what Article 2 also said, Section 1 of the Constitution, is that each state would be given a number of electors equivalent to the size of their congressional delegation. And under the Constitution, each state gets 2 senators and entitled to at least 1 member of the House of Representatives. So each state would get a minimum of 3 electors, and then it would go up based upon population. So it would be state legislators who would get to select the electors who would vote for president and vice president. Each state would get a number of electors equivalent to the size of its congressional delegation. However, electors could not be members of Congress. Okay. When the electors were then casting their votes, they would cast their votes for two people, one of which could not be a resident or inhabitant of their state. So each elector, having been picked by the state, a number determined by their congressional delegation size, each elector would be given two votes. They could cast their first vote, and then their second vote had to be for somebody who was not a resident of their state. The belief back then was what? That we were all parochial, that if given free reign, what would an elector do? Vote for a president and vice presidential candidate, both from the same state. And so we were not going to allow to do that. Also, the Constitution said that electors would meet in their own home states. Now, I know when we talk about the Electoral College now, we have this image that they're convening and coming across the country in this big body that casts votes. No, the framers said that the electors would meet in their own states, because of, remember, this is a horse and buggy era, that there's a transportation issue getting to anywhere, let alone the state capital. But two, the framers were worried about mischief, maybe fearful, to use that word again, fearful that if the delegates, the electors from the different states got together in one place, who knows what kind of mischief would occur if they got together. Okay, so the electors would cast the votes in their own state. Again, each elector getting two votes, of one of which those votes could not be for a resident of their state. And under the original Constitution, the candidate who received the majority of electoral votes would become president of the United States. And then the runner-up who got the second most votes would become vice president. And notice here that this is what? An assumption that political parties wouldn't exist. That what? The leading vote getter is president, number two, vice president. We weren't thinking of parties of Democrat, Republican, or Federalist, anti-Federalist. They were hoping that wouldn't exist. But what would happen though, if, let us say, nobody got a majority of the electoral vote? Well, this is where it gets more complicated now. It said that the original Constitution said if nobody got the majority of electoral vote, then the top 5 electoral vote getters would have their names sent to the U.S. House of Representatives. And at that point, the U.S. House of Representatives would pick the president. And how we would do it would be each state in the House, not each House member, but each state in the House would be given one electoral vote, or rather one other vote, I should say, not electoral vote, pardon me. Each state in the House of Representatives would be given one vote, and whichever candidate received the majority of states would become president of the United States. And then after the House selected the president, then the person with the greatest number of electors, or greatest number of votes at that point from the Electoral College, would become vice president. And if no tie, eventually the Senate would pick the vice president. So under this original schema, states pick the electors pick the president. If nobody gets a majority of the electoral vote, then it devolves to the House of Representatives eventually to pick the president, with the Senate picking the vice president. Sound confusing enough? It was. But now we're going to develop this a little bit more. All right. Now, why the Electoral College? I gave you some reasons before, that about the fact that it's all about fear. It's all about perhaps compromise, that our founding framers, again, as Richard Hofstadter pointed out, were also great in terms of compromisers. They were politicians. They wanted to strike deals. They wanted to preserve the Union. But Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Paper 68, as well as Martin Diamond, a historian, political scientist who was writing back in the 1970s, perhaps provide the most cogent arguments for the Electoral College. What Alexander Hamilton argued was that the Electoral College would balance accountability with independence, that he would be able to rise above public opinion to be a leader, while at the same time be accountable to the people through the electors. It was also hoped that these electors would somehow be wise sages who would choose on the behalf of the best interests of the country and not be dragged into partisan politics. The belief was also, and this is Martin Diamond's argument, that it would aid small states, that it would help smaller states, give them a little bit extra oomph in selection of president. He doesn't use the word oomph, that's mine, of course. The belief was also that the Electoral College would overcome sectionalism and regionalism to try to encourage people to and electors to pick presidents who would represent all of the people, not just one section or area. And then there was, of course, perhaps the fear that what? Average everyday people would not be able to pick the president. They wouldn't be smart enough or wise enough. And so these become part of the arguments for the original Electoral College. But as many people have pointed out, the Electoral College has really never operated from the start according to the way that the framers believed. And one of the first changes that occurred was the emergence of political parties. Think about it. In 1788, after the Constitution had been ratified and it was now going into effect, the first election occurs. Well, everybody wants George. What I mean by that, everybody wants George Washington to be president of the United States. If we were writing political ads today, or writing a political ad back then like we would write today, it would have been what? Everybody loves George or something like that. So George Washington runs as president. He gets by far the majority of the electoral vote, and John Adams gets second. He becomes his vice president. His first administration is basically has people like Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson. 1792 occurs. Everybody still wants George. He gets reelected again John Adams. But something then emerges. Starting after the 92 election, political parties start to emerge. Thomas Jefferson becomes the head of what's called the Democratic Republican Party, the forerunner to the Democratic Party. John Adams becomes the head of the Federalist Party. And the two parties get to such loggerheads that, again, if anybody remembers in American history, by 1798, we have the Alien and Sedition Act. We have ugly laws about persecuting people on the basis of their political beliefs. But in 1792, we get, again, a Washington Adams ticket. Adams, Jefferson start to form separate parties. By 1796, 1796, we have a presidential election. John Adams running against Thomas Jefferson. There are different political parties. John Adams gets the most electoral votes, the majority. He becomes president. Thomas Jefferson becomes vice president. And at least for a few years, they wind up in a very ugly relationship that eventually they overcome later in their careers again. But the parties are emerging at this point, going separate ways. Also, during this time, Thomas Jefferson is now starting to try to plan for running for president in 1800. He starts encouraging state delegations to say, well, when you select your electors, why not do it on an all or nothing basis? And by that, award electors on the basis of giving all of them to one political party as opposed to another. And this eventually pays off in 1800, where many people argue the 1800 election might very well be one of the most important in American history. It is when the Federalist Party under John Adams loses to Thomas Jefferson's party, and there's what? A peaceful transition of power from one party to another, establishing what we hope will continue to be to this day, a peaceful transition of power from one party to another when somebody loses. But it's very well developed from that very first election. So what we started seeing is now this push, all or nothing, for the awarding of electoral votes by states. But the 1800 election is also critical in another way too. Remember, at this point, the electors each get 2 ballots. And in 1800, Thomas Jefferson is running with a running mate named Aaron Burr. The electors casting their ballots cast their ballots all for Thomas Jefferson. He gets his electoral votes. They then cast their second ballot for Aaron Burr. And guess what? Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr are now tied. It goes to the House of Representatives. This is the first of 2 times in American history that the House of Representatives actually has picked the President of the United States. And there were debates back and forth. The Federalists weren't going to concede certain things, but eventually Thomas Jefferson prevailed after several votes. He became president, and Aaron Burr became vice president. This then prompted the adoption of the 12th Amendment, which somewhat tacitly recognized the emergence of political parties. And I'll talk about that change in a minute here in more detail, but it essentially said that electors now would cast 2 ballots, one for the president, one for the vice president, still having to have one of those persons who they cast a ballot for not be a resident of their state, because they were still concerned about what? Parochialism, about mischief, about people favoring their own state. So this becomes our second change. If the first change, or third change, I should say, if the first change is the emergence of parties, the second change is sort of getting states to try to change the electors to do this on the basis of all or nothing. The third change was the 12th Amendment. We now have a fourth change. In the 1820s, states started gradually letting the people cast ballots to pick the electors. And at this point, we still know it was a relatively restrictive notion of who the people were who were allowed to vote under state law. It was still going to be whites, still going to be males, still going to be people who were older, more affluent, oftentimes still of a particular religious persuasion. All of that sort of kicked in. But what we saw here now is the next shift of the states saying that, guess what? We're going to let the people determine who the electors are to pick the president of the United States. So that becomes our next change in terms of how things emerged. And so we'd add that in. We can also add in a couple of other things that have occurred over time, and then I'll do a summary here. We also know that over time, for example, there were the addition of presidential term limits so that you couldn't keep running for president again. We also know there was a constitutional amendment eventually that granted Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes to be in the presidential election. And we know that there was a constitutional amendment that fixed the date for the expiration of the current presidential term, as well as the beginning of the next presidential term. And that date was noon on January 20th, the year after the presidential election was held. So what can we say in terms of now what the Electoral College looks like? Well, here's the current rules and the way they operate. First, it's still what? States pick the president of the United States. There is still no individual right to vote for president of the United States. We were reminded that 20 years ago in Bush v. Gore, when there was a dispute over that, over the awarding of electors there. In fact, I know this very personally in a sense because I teach election law, and during Florida 2000, I was called quite a bit by reporters. But I remember one night, it was about 6 o'clock at night, and I got a call from the Florida legislature that said, can you be here at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. the next morning to testify about what you think about the merits of the state of Florida, saying that we're just going to resolve this dispute in Florida by directly awarding the electoral votes. Well, I could never get down there because I couldn't get a flight at that late hour, but we know it's a possibility. We know it's been talked about this year in light of the pandemic. Could states just say, well, if people can't vote on election day, we're just going to award the electoral votes? Yeah, they can do that. So keep that in mind. There's still no right to vote for president of the United States. It is merely by the grace of state legislatures that we cast a ballot on November 3rd or before that date to be able to select the electors to pick the president of the United States. I should point out, when I was at Harper College as an undergraduate, that in 1976 is my first year there. The New York State ballots for presidential elections still listed the name of the electors on the ballot. And one of my friends, actually, Paul Smith, who used to teach in political science back in the 1970s, his wife, Joyce Smith, was an elector, and she was an elector for Jimmy Carter, and she actually got to cast a vote for the president of the United States. That was so cool to actually know somebody who actually voted for president of the United States. So again, it's still, I'm going to get to this one comment here in a second here about, I'll get to it eventually here. It looks like it's directed to panelists, to all panels, which I guess is me, of course. So it's still no right to vote for president. States still pick the president of the United States. States still are awarded electors based upon the number or the size of their congressional delegation. Electors still can't be members of Congress. Each elector gets 2 votes. 1 vote is cast for president. 1 vote is cast for vice president. Again, they both can't be residents of the same state. And the electors still meet in their respective states. And with that, the person who gets the majority of the electoral vote would get to be what? President of the United States. And technically, you could have an elector who would, they could vote differently for vice president, but effectively they're almost running like slates anymore. What most states now do is award the authority to pick the electors to the different candidates who qualify for the presidential ballot. And so by that, Biden has his slate of electors for New York or New Jersey or Minnesota. Trump has his slate of electors, and whoever wins the vote in that state gets their state slate of electors picked. Also, we know that if nobody gets a majority of the electoral vote, what happens at this point? The top 3 electoral vote getters have their names passed to the House. The House, each state in the House is given a vote. Vote is a delegation. Quorum of 2/3 is required. If somebody gets a majority of the House vote, they become president of the United States. Or I say if, that's what they have to do. They have to get that. The Senate picks the vice president, where each senator gets to cast 1 vote. Now, what happens if, for example, nobody can get a majority of the state delegations in the House of Representatives to pick the president? And by the way, this is the new Senate, the new House elected this year, so it would be the new people taking office the following year. If there's no person who gets a majority of states to pick them as president, what happens then is whoever gets picked as vice president of the United States would serve as the acting president until such time as president is selected. But what if, by some chance, there is neither a selection for president or vice president? Then it devolves to what? The Presidential Succession Act. And remember, under our Constitution, the current president's term expires on noon on January 20th. So for our purposes, next year, 2021, if for some reason there is no president picked, no vice president picked, the Speaker of House becomes president of the United States. And it is pretty likely that, unless I'm completely wrong, the Democrats hold the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House. She would become acting vice president come next year. Also, just throw in a couple other things here. Remember, in 48 out of 50 states now, it is winner take all. Whoever gets the most popular vote in the state gets all the electoral votes in the state. That's currently how it works. Let me take a few questions here too. Okay. President Trump has plans to unconstantly change many of the items that you've just mentioned. He does, but at the end of the day, even with the changes on the Supreme Court, I don't think he can make these changes because at the end of the day, the Constitution, I think, is pretty clear on this. We're electors, and are they still obligated to vote in a certain way? No, under the original Constitution, the and under the Constitution, still the electors are free to do what they want. The framers wanted them to be free to do what they do, to choose, so they could pick in the best interest of the country. But over time, several states now have passed what's called faithless electoral laws that require the electors to vote the way the popular vote goes. I think the number of states is about a half a dozen, and the Supreme Court upheld that faithless electoral law earlier this year. So states can bind electors, can fine them, can replace them with alternates if they don't vote the way they're supposed to. So if the vice president would get chosen from the Senate and the president gets chosen from the House, then it's possible the two parties could be in the White House and have to work together. Yeah, it could be. Could we imagine a scenario where, let's say, the House of Representatives remains in control of Democrats, and let's say Democrats control a majority of the state delegations, Republicans control the Senate, and they each cast their own vote. Each senator gets to cast their own vote. Could we have, well, let's just make up a scenario here. Could we have a Biden-Pence scenario? Yeah, the Constitution would set it up in a way that could be possible. Would that be good for the country? That's a really great debate. Whether or not it would actually finally force the two parties to work together, perhaps yes. Was there ever any consideration, regardless of time period, for the U.S. or its government to use mixed member proportional representation rather than the Electoral College? Not really. Now, we've had debates about saying, could Congress be multi-member? And by federal law, that's been barred. But no, in terms of changing around the ideas of it, no. Now, Maine this year, state of Maine this year, is going to use ranked choice voting for the selection of the president as an experiment. But no, we've not come up with that idea in terms of the change. But I will say that over time, we've had many, many proposals to try to get rid of the Electoral College. Why? In part, and let's just talk about a few problems here. One of them is the fact that we have had several elections in American history. Two of them first, where Congress has picked the president. We have had 5 elections in American history where we've had a split between the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. That it is entirely possible, as we saw 4 years ago, for somebody to get 3 million more popular votes than the person who wins the Electoral College. We've also seen over time, in terms of some issues with the Electoral College, that there's been a few occasional faithless electors, but it's never really affected the outcome of an election. So we've had several of these, what I'm going to call unanticipated I'll say unanticipated side effects of the Electoral College. But I want to throw in some arguments back and forth, so we still have some time here to do Q&A and maybe debate keeping the Electoral College. There's been sort of other issues surrounding the Electoral College over time. For example, the 1876 Electoral College involved Bill Tilden from New York getting the most popular vote, running against Rutherford B. Hayes. And in that election, there were disputes over the seating of the Electoral College delegations from, among other places, of course, Florida. And what happened there is that the Democrats finally conceded and said, Hayes can be president, but guess what? You only get to be president if you agree to withdraw the federal troops from the South if we give you the presidency. Why was that important? In doing that, that ended Reconstruction and the enforcement of Reconstruction, and basically ended basically the era of efforts post-Civil War to try to provide voting rights and equality for African Americans, and really ushered in nearly 100 years of what's called the Jim Crow. Additionally, some people will say, what are some of the problems with the Electoral College? That what it does, it favors big states, that the framers never envisioned the Californias and New Yorks, the Texas and Floridas of the world with large populations. That if you compare the popular vote to the Electoral College vote, it distorts victories. For example, in 92, Bill Clinton wins the presidency with about 42% of the popular vote. Ross Perot gets 18% of the popular vote as a third party candidate. But Ross Perot never wins any electoral votes because he never gets a majority of the popular vote or plurality of the popular vote in any state. Bill Clinton gets what? Almost 360 electoral votes. Looks like a blowout in the Electoral College. Also, and this is the subject of a lot of my research, that with the way the Electoral College is set up, it might discourage some smaller candidates from visiting smaller states. That who's going to go visit in Idaho and North Dakota or something like that. But also that with the winner take all system, which is done by statute, not by constitution, that what the winner take all does, especially in light of the current polarization that we have, it's created both a situation, what I call the swing state phenomena, that going into this election, I knew 43 states were non-competitive. I knew how New York was going to vote in the Electoral College, California, Massachusetts, Louisiana, and so forth. So it basically gives a small number of states disproportionate influence as swing states. And also think about it now. If you're a Republican in New York or a Democrat in Mississippi, what incentive do you have to vote? Not much of one, because why? Because those states were going to go so overwhelmingly Democrat or so overwhelmingly Republican. If I'm in the minor political party as a voter in that state, I have almost no incentive to vote, almost no voice. And so on many scores, people criticize the Electoral College for favoring big states, disenfranchising people, for creating the swing state phenomena. It also didn't address the issue of sectionalism, that we now have what? Sectional areas in the country which are solidly Democrat or solidly Republican. It didn't overcome regionalism. But in defense of the Electoral College, one could say that perhaps it does protect minority voices. Perhaps it does protect those people who are from the Nebraskas, the North Dakotas, the South Dakotas, and that, who might get totally ignored in a presidential election if it were straight popular vote, and therefore this creates some incentive to care about them. Or what if we were straight popular vote and the elections were very, very close? Would it perhaps trigger recounts across many states in the country versus having it being a 50-state election right now, where if something were to melt down again in Florida, we might only need a recount in Florida or litigation in Florida as opposed to across the country? So I set this up to say that in many ways, the United States operates as an odd outlier. We are perhaps the only country in the world where we do not select our president by direct popular vote if we have one, as some countries have presidents, or the prime minister or the head of the government is not picked in some way by a direct popular vote. The question is, should we get rid of it? Should we, as I said, resolve that the Electoral College should be abolished and replaced with the direct popular vote? To do that, remember, we would need a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to agree on the change. We are probably in such a polarized environment right now, we probably couldn't get 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of all the states to agree that what? Fresh air is nice, sunshine feels good, warm temperatures are good. My point being is that I doubt we're going to get that agreement, even though about 60 to 65% of the American public says get rid of the Electoral College. There has been more amendments addressing the Electoral College than any other institution in American politics. So I leave us with this question: should we keep it or should we scrap it? Okay, so I want to set us up for questions. And the national popular vote, as Liam's pointing out here, is one of the options that's being thrown out here, which is the idea of saying that states pass laws to say that they would agree to award their electoral votes based upon the national popular vote. That's interstate compact kicks in when a number of states agree to it. That's equivalent to 270 electoral votes. They're not there yet. That's one option. Another is straight popular vote. As I mentioned to you, I think that's going to be hard to do with a constitutional amendment. What I also throw out as a possibility is what they do in Maine and what they do in Nebraska is they award the electoral votes based upon congressional districts. And therefore, it's basically plurality vote in terms of, or winner take all, I can't really call it winner take all, plurality vote based on congressional districts. And if that were to happen, for example, you might create an incentive for a Republican to go to New York, because why? He might not win, or she might not win New York City, but she might be able to pick up parts of New York State, upstate New York, and win some electoral votes that way. All right, so let's see. I want to make sure I'm getting all the questions that are there. So let's throw me some questions here. If we got a few more here, we have, 8 or 9 minutes to be able to pose them. Who's got some questions? By the way, there's a quiz at the end of this. You do know that, and you can't sign off until you actually pass this quiz about the Electoral College. Okay, if we brought more recognition to the third parties, how would this alter the Electoral College in its future elections? This is actually, again, a good question here, because I think one of the other criticisms of the Electoral College is that it discourages people from voting for third parties. And I'm going to call this the Ralph Nader effect. Back during Florida 2000, many people, especially Democrats, blame Ralph Nader for why George Bush was elected. And they say, had all these people not voted for Ralph Nader or Pat Buchanan in Florida, perhaps Al Gore would have won and Gore would have been president instead. Or some people are saying 4 years ago that between the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and a couple of others, they racked up about 5% of the vote, and maybe that threw the election from one candidate to the other. And what's happened really over time is that there is evidence that people, when they vote, are fearful for voting for a third party because they think, gosh, if I vote for a third party candidate, that candidate doesn't win, that's essentially like what? Me casting a ballot for the person I dislike the most. And so there is evidence that the Electoral College discourages voting for third parties. And so perhaps we might be able to incentivize more third parties if we went to something that wasn't a Electoral College winner take all system. Just looking here. What do you folks think? Can I get to ask you folks a question and ask, would you support getting rid of the Electoral College and replacing it with something else? This is what I should have had. What we should have had set up here. I didn't think about. We should have had a poll set up here. So at the end of the talk, we could have done a poll on this. That would have been
just
pretty
thinking
cool.
that a poll would have been great. Would have been.
Yes, I hadn't thought about this just now. 4 years from now, we'll do this again. We'll have a poll set up at that point. Okay. It depends on the options. Yes. Okay. I'm looking here. Okay, let me just throw out a couple of other thoughts here for people to sort of chew on here. Is that my students, for example, unequivocally argue that the Electoral College is just really a racist institution, and its board of racism should be getting rid of. And I did talk about the racial origins to this. And I just throw this out as a discussion here. To what extent does the Electoral College reflect those racial origins? Does it reflect a vision of American politics, democracy, and so forth that is outdated. Perhaps some people think that's the case here. And again, I sort of throw that out here as things to consider is that if we could actually reform, if we could actually make changes, how would we do that to reflect what our contemporary notions of democracy are? And again, in Minnesota, where I am, where my house is about 5 miles from where George Floyd died, the debates over race in politics are pretty serious right now in terms of trying to think about them. I like the idea of having an option that would okay, something there. I'm not sure. Good. I think we should abolish Electoral College. Okay, good. Okay. Would a popular vote in the number of electors on the East Coast possibly seal an election before May 8th got to vote on the West Coast? Yes, that becomes an issue here. To what extent would there be a bandwagon effect or sort of a biasing of the elections? We know back in 1980, it's an old study that was done. It is actually a movie called The Made for TV Election. You can find it on YouTube now. What would happen in 1980 is when AP called the election early for Ronald Reagan, it led to either people walking out from voting because they thought, why vote? Or it led to people starting to vote like crazy for Ronald Reagan. So I wonder this too, would direct popular vote do that? Perhaps, alter the elections. Now, well, I say, unfortunately, from my perspective, I actually like a rule that some other countries have. For example, like you can't do campaigning in the last 24 hours of an election or run commercials. We certainly don't allow those kind of bans here. We certainly wouldn't allow a ban on news reporting on votes coming out, but this is definitely a consideration here. And also looking at it here, would this give underrepresented groups a voice? I think there's a case to be made that getting rid of the Electoral College could actually do that. That's why I'm saying I can make arguments on both sides here. And somebody just mentioned the fact they grew up about 2 to 3 miles from where George Floyd died as well. Yeah. On a side note here, where I live in St. Paul, on the worst night, not of the demonstrations, of the riots, there's a difference between the two. I could see the smoke billowing from the west, and about 2 miles north of my house, where there were also riots in St. Paul, I could see the smoke billowing from there. So I had smoke coming from two different directions. It was a quite scary process, needless to say. I'd like to see a process that encouraged more political parties. Again, this is the argument that some people give for abolishing it. How would the process begin to work towards abolishing, changing the Electoral College system? Well, two different things. If we wanted to get rid of it by completely, that would have to be the constitutional amendment process, and that would have to start either in Congress by introducing a constitutional amendment, or in the alternative, a state constitutional convention. And we've never had that, but those are the two possibilities there. If we were talking about, let's say, changing the winner take all process or something like that, that could be done by state legislative or state statutory mechanisms. So it depends on what our scope of reform is, what we wanted to do. But outright abolishing it really is amending the Constitution. And that would start more likely than not with Congress. Okay, I think it's unrealistic to abolish Electoral College. It exists to protect government interests, so should simultaneously reflect the popular vote. Maybe a weighted calculation would be a solution. Okay, yeah, and maybe weighted, and that's sort of what my idea is, a little bit of a weighted solution. I like a Congress system that embodies that of Canada or the UK, where it's not just Democrats, Republicans office, but also third parties. Does this affect the way the country is run in any way? Yeah. I mean, what they have there is parliamentary systems where either you win an outright majority or you have to cobble together a majority. But their systems are different because they have a prime minister. Prime minister is picked by the party that wins the most votes. Remember, in Canada and the UK, they don't have a president. They have Canada. Well, I was going to say UK has the Queen. She's the symbolic head of the country. For us, the president is both the symbolic head of the country and the head of the government at the same time. And our separation of power system is not set up in a way that allows Congress to pick the president. In fact, it was set up not to do that. So we would have to be thinking about a fairly significant change in how we think about Congress and representation or our national government to get a model that looks like the UK or looks like Canada. Again, not to say that it's not a bad model, it's a very good model, but that would take a lot of constitutional amendments to do something like that. I think that there could be a combination. If the popular vote and Electoral College don't agree, there could be a further process. It doesn't happen too often, so it could be effective. And again, there may be other solutions out there that we come up with. This could be this is what some people are saying is the national popular vote as a mechanism. I mean, ultimately, January 6th is the important date we should be thinking about here, is that if after the elections take place next week, on December 14th is when the electors meet to cast the electoral votes. And after that, it's January 6th. January 6th by the Constitution is when both houses of Congress meet together to essentially validate or verify the electoral vote. And at that point, Congress is the ultimate check. They could say that the electoral vote was not right in a state, or they could reject the allocations. They have a variety of possibilities, and eventually select the president themselves. Can a candidate challenge the Electoral College vote? No, not per se. They can challenge the popular vote within a state, obviously. But what in order to challenge the electoral vote, I can't really envision a scenario where a candidate gets to go to the courts to say, I don't like the electoral vote the way it occurred, and challenge it. I mean, I could probably think of some bizarre scenario where somehow the state picks the electors do it in a very racially discriminatory or gender discrimination way, maybe something on that. But that would take a really unusual scenario. When it gets to Congress, the presidential candidate can't challenge it. In order to raise a challenge to the electoral vote in Congress, you have to have a member of both the House and the Senate agree to do the challenge. And unless that candidate were, I don't know, Kamala Harris, I don't know, let's throw that out here. She's a vice presidential candidate. Could she perhaps challenge it if she thought there was something wrong? She could probably raise the challenge. But again, per se, a candidate can't do that challenge. I do want to underscore one other thing, because I know I hear all these fears and fantasies out there. Again, remember at the end of the day that there is some hard deadlines here, and there is that firm constitutional deadline that says that the president is out of office on noon on January 20th, for our purposes, 2021. And so I know lots of people have sort of worried about or fantasized about, well, what if the current president doesn't want to leave? The Constitution is clear. He's done. I mean, there is sort of no really debate on this, that if he's lost, he's out. Have we ever had a non-peaceful transition of power? Yes. I would say we have one great example, 1860, the Civil War. As Lincoln gets elected, South Carolina secedes, and we eventually get the Civil War. That's our one glaring breakdown in terms of a non-peaceful transition to power. And that's a pretty ugly one too. So that would be my one example. What do you think, Aaron? Do you think we've answered every question there is?
It's a great question, David. I think there's probably still some questions out there, as we don't even know what's yet to come with this election.
Yes.
But thank you so much for sharing your expertise with all of us. On behalf of Harper Edge, I'm Erin Cody. I'm the director of Harper Edge. We were thrilled to have you this evening. We might have to bring you back to process the election. So those of you who've come tonight, thank you so much. Our alumni, our community members, our faculty, our staff, our students. Thank you to CCPA, our collaborators. as well as our colleagues in advancement, the Center for Learning and Teaching. This event was fully a collaboration, and we're so glad. In Harper Edge, this was a no-brainer for us as students face what may be their first voting opportunity to understand what the Electoral College really means. So thank you so much for explaining it a bit more. Everyone out there, November 3rd is coming. Don't forget to exercise your right to vote, and do stay in touch with Harper Edge. We're very excited to connect you to more opportunities. David, something else?
Yeah, one last thing I also put in here, if people want to copy it down, I think it's already lost here. Somewhere in here, I put my email, dschultz@hamlin.edu. And if you want to follow up with me, happy to talk to you. And also, if by any chance anybody is here who I went to school with, send me an email. It'd be great to connect also. And also just sort of mention here that